My name is Michael Hemisath, and I'm the president of St. John's University. And on behalf of the University Chair in Critical Thinking, the Asian Studies Program, and the Global Center at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University, I want to welcome you this evening to our conversation with James Fallows and Gary Eichten. But you'll hear more about them in just a second. What I want to do first is introduce Rachel Mullen, who is a South Dakota native, proud South Dakotan. And for the faculty members in the audience that have children, Rachel is a faculty brat, and so it can show you that you can actually have some hope that your children might turn out okay. Her father's a history professor at Augustana College. Rachel has been interested in international affairs for a long time. She studied abroad in China. She worked as an intern for Senator Tim Johnson from South Dakota. And this summer, she's going to be doing an internship program in Bosnia through the Global Center at St. Ben's and St. John's. And the other exciting news for Rachel is that she just won a Truman Fellowship. A Truman Fellowship is designed for students that are interested in public service and international affairs, broadly speaking. And it's a national fellowship, and it is almost as competitive as things like Rhodes and Marshalls. There were 72 winners? Only 6, sorry, I made it even less competitive than it was. 62 students across the whole country won one of these. So this is a very impressive thing for one of our students to win. So with no further ado, let me introduce you to Rachel Mullen, and she'll get a chance to introduce you to our guests.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming tonight. I have the esteemed pleasure of introducing our two wonderful guests for the evening. Our first is James Fallows. James Fallows grew up in Redlands, California. From there, he went on to receive his undergraduate degree from Harvard in American History and Literature. While at Harvard, he was also the president of the Crimson and was actually the subject and inspiration of the movie A Small Circle of Friends. After Harvard, he went on to become a Rhodes Scholar, as competitive as the Truman, and earned a graduate degree in economics from Oxford. Since there, his career has taken a variety of angles. He worked as a speechwriter for President Carter from 1977 to 1979. He was also a program designer at Microsoft, but only lasted about 6 months. We're not really sure the story there. He then went on to work as the editor of U.S. News and World Report from 1996 to 1998. He has also been a frequent contributor to NPR's Morning Edition, and since 2009 has been a regular for Weekend All Things Considered. In addition, he has worked as a national correspondent for The Atlantic for close to 30 years. During this time, he has lived in Seattle, Berkeley, Austin, Tokyo, Kuala Lumpur, Shanghai, and Beijing. He is currently the chair in U.S. media at the USChina Center at the University of Sydney in Australia. Fallows' list of awards and honors is vast. A 5-time nominee for the National Book Award, he won the National Book Award in 1983 for National Defense. He also won the American Book Award for Nonfiction, as well as an Emmy for his series Doing Business in China. His book, Blind into Baghdad, has been called one of the best books on the topic ever written. His most recent book, China Airborne, has received rave reviews. Fun fact, he's also a pilot. Who knew? It's truly an honor for the University of St. John's to host such an exemplary guest, and I welcome you tonight. Our second guest is Mr. Gary Eichten. Many of you may recognize Gary from his 2013 McCarthy Center Scholar in Residence. You may also remember when I epically failed at introducing him at that event, so they were kind enough to give me a second chance. We are thrilled to have him back with us at this event. Gary Eichten has spent over 40 years in Minnesota Public Radio and filled a variety of roles, including news director, special events producer, and station manager. He is most fondly remembered, though, for his 20 years as the host of Midday. As well as in his early years, Gary was instrumental in expanding NPR from a small Collegeville-based radio station to one of the top stations in the nation. Throughout his life, Gary has earned numerous awards, including the 2011 Graven Award by the Penmark Public Affairs Journalism Awards Board. He was also inducted into the Pavic Museum of Broadcasters Hall of Fame in 2007. In tonight's program, Gary will lead an interview with James Fallows on a topic ranging from his latest book, Airborne in China, to his thoughts on American politics and the media today. From the brief conversation I had with them at dinner, you're in for a truly delightful evening. We also invite the audience to take part in this conversation. Dr. Hayes, as well as myself, will be running around with microphones if you have questions throughout this experience. Now with that, I ask you to please silence your cell phones and welcome me in joining our two esteemed guests for this evening.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. So we've got a Truman, we've got a Rhodes. I was lucky to get a bachelor's, you know. Had to scrape and scrap for that. Well, anyway, you know, the frustrating thing about being on stage with James Fallows is that, for an hour, is that you could sit up here for several hours. The biggest problem is trying to figure out what not to talk about. The guy is well-versed on so many different subjects, China, politics, journalism, go on and on. But I thought tonight we'd start with a couple of items in the news and then move on to some of those broader subjects. Jim, I guess the top item in the news today is the defeat in the Senate of the background checks legislation, gun control, and so on. Did that come as a surprise to you?
Let me buy myself 15 seconds of thinking time by saying my thanks to you, Gary, for very graciously agreeing to honoring me by being on the stage, to Rachel for the gracious introduction, Nick Hayes, and all the colleagues here at St. John's and St. Ben's. I really had wonderful memories of my time here 10 years ago and was glad to have the invitation to come this time. Later this year, my wife and I will be back. She is a Minnesota girl. Like Nick Hayes, her first elementary school was Christ the King in Edina. So thank you for having me here. The Senate's failed attempt to break a filibuster on the background check bill in the Senate, I think, was interesting in two ways. It's not surprising to me that the agenda President Obama originally proposed about gun control, gun safety, has not advanced, because over the last, say, 15 years, the landscape has been so forbidding for anything in this area. And really, if you had asked, it's a testament to how emotional and horrific the Newtown shootings were, and then how much President Obama decided to bet on this issue that we're even discussing it. Because if we had this discussion 6 months ago, before the Newtown shooting, people would have said, despite Aurora, despite Tucson, despite anything else you could think of, there's just no hope of gun control moving through the Congress. So that moves somewhere. The other point that I'll give you the 20-second version of something I could give you a 4-hour hobby horse lecture about. Most of the filibusters in U.S. history have happened in the last 6 years. It's been a deliberate strategy that when the Democrats moved to the majority in the Senate in 2006, Mitch McConnell and his Republican Party decided to change the filibuster from an occasional thing to a test for almost every proposal of substance or nomination that was controversial. And so instead of having a 51-vote threshold for getting anything done, there's now essentially a 60-vote threshold. And the reason I mention this is if you look at your papers tonight or websites, they're going to say this failed by a 54-46 vote. They won't tell you the 54 were for it. It failed to break a filibuster. But most of the news coverage will say it takes now 60 votes to pass the Senate, which is just, it's a recreated reality that I think is corrosive to our political system that's really happening before our eyes.
Any way out of that bind?
I think that it requires, President Obama has from time to time argued the filibuster is an issue. Last week I was in California interviewing Jerry Brown, the once and present governor. He became governor when he was 36, he became governor when he was 72. And the idea that you could do the same job at twice the age is interesting. And he was arguing that he thought the greatest threat to American democracy was the 60-vote threshold for getting anything done, because it meant you couldn't have a majority moving forward in anything. So it requires, number one, some senators thinking that they're going to be willing to allow this power to be eroded, because even the Democrats know that sometime soon they're going to be in a minority. They would like to have some power themselves. But I think it requires some people to make the case that this is really destructive to the country, as I think it is.
Another headline item, the Boston bombings, of course. Any lessons that we can draw from that?
So this is something that I view not at a distance, but more immediate than that. I've run that marathon a number of times. One of my sons has run that marathon. The second bomb went off right in front of the building that was the Atlantic's home before we moved to D.C. And I had a lot of friends who were running in the marathon on Monday. I've been sort of out of the news most of the last 24 hours because I've been traveling to get here and being in classes, but what has struck me so far is actually a positive sign. After the whole theory of terrorism is that the damage it does is not the attack, but the reaction it provokes. That there was a horrible, horrible attack now 12 years ago on 9/11 and killed thousands of people, but the damage done by the reaction was greater even than that, inducing a war in Iraq, which I talked about 10 years ago, the change in air travel because of all this. And so the question all along has been, would it be possible for the U.S. to endure some other attack and not go crazy? And so far it looks like the reaction has been not going crazy, of people saying, yes, let's have another marathon and let's do it. That if you're going to live in a free society, you can't guarantee perfect safety, and so you can't ensure you're not going to get attacked. You can assure you're not going to go crazy in reaction. And I saw just before I was coming here a number of newspaper columns where Dennis Lehane, the famous Boston-based novelist, is saying they picked the wrong town. He's saying that we only believe in three things in Boston: politics, the Red Sox, and revenge. And so saying, watch out. And Jeffrey Goldmark, my colleague at The Atlantic, was saying he remembered 10 years ago a horrible bombing in Israel in a restaurant, and lots of people were killed. And he said the next day the restaurant was open for business. And I think the worst thing that would come from this is some round-the-clock cable news, new age of terror stuff. And the best thing is saying, this is horrible, these people deserve all of our sympathy, and we should hunt down whoever did it, but let's not go crazy.
What do you make, speaking of going crazy, what was going on with the news media today, where you had dueling reputable news organizations not quite accusing each other of being wrong and lying, but coming awfully close? Each had their own sources, some claiming suspects had been arrested, suspects had been seen, others saying, no, that's not true. That's comforting.
So again, I've been out of the news mire most of today, but just from checking it. So CNN was saying there are suspects, and who was saying there were not suspects? Was it
NPR, among others.
Or and AP, yeah. And so I think that
I got a call, just parenthetically, and not to make this too... I got a call from a fellow who I worked with for years who was outraged that NPR wasn't on the air reporting the news, and I said, well, maybe there isn't any news here.
It's, I was in the info swirl during the first couple hours of this on Monday afternoon, and then the endless truth of crisis reporting is most of what you hear at first is wrong, and that was the case. There were 5 bombs, there was a bomb at JFK Library, there was a Saudi person in custody, blah, 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 and that was just flat out wrong. The New York Post, lots of people need to be fired there. They had until about 8 p.m. on Monday a headline saying 12 people killed, and also a Saudi, and they didn't care. It was so I think we have the endless reality of crisis reporting, which, as you know, is always wrong, accelerated by Twitter and everything else and the competitive edge, and what is the only sane human and journalistic impulse, which is to say we don't know and won't know for a while, is really hard. But that I think is really the only appropriate impulse. So you were seeing some of the news today, and I wasn't. Who was saying we don't know, let's hold on?
I think NPR, for the most part, was leading that part of the charge, although I'm sure there were some others as well. But
and just to horn in there, the cases you can think of people rushing to get the story first and being wrong outweigh by about 100-fold the cases of somebody getting the story first by a 1-minute or 5-minute interval, and that's important. It's important that they are the first one by a minute to say Saudi victim or Saudi suspect or whoever is caught. So I think maybe this will be an occasion for some reflection. Who knows?
Are news organizations rewarded more for being first or for being right?
As you well know, a combination of the two for different news organizations. My magazine is actually in an interesting straddle right now. We're a monthly magazine, which means that right now I am way late on something for a June issue. And so normally we're planning things that are like 6 months in advance. On the other hand, we have a website and we have Twitter feeds, and so there it matters to do it quickly. And so it's a balance. You want to be as fast as what they've always said about journalism, as you know, is the best version of the truth in the time available, because that's what makes it journalism. Otherwise, it'd be history, but it's something by the next morning's deadline or the next month's deadline or that next hour's newscast. So this is an accelerated version of that best version in the time available, but maybe pushing it too far.
Off to China, you said on National Public Radio a few weeks ago that anytime you're away for more than a month or two, things have changed in China. So you just got back from another visit last month. What changed?
Three things I can think of. First, in the north of China, in Beijing, the pollution has reached such a hideous level as to become a national emergency. In my view, I've been arguing for a long time that the biggest challenge to China's continued development is pollution of all sorts. Air is the most visible, water is probably the most serious, heavy metal, which is causing birth defects. Cancer is now the leading cause of death in China, which is not true in other countries. But in Beijing, I won't go into all the numbers, but it just is incredible. So when I was a kid in Southern California, the smog was bad. I played in the tennis team for my high school. We once played a tournament in Pomona where, no kidding, you couldn't see the ball when the other guy served it. So it's sort of coming out of nowhere. And it was way worse than that in China. There's one of the fancy international schools in Beijing has installed an airlock over their playing field so that the kids can go outside. So the pollution is worse, and the government realizes that. That's one. A second is the change in the workforce. I got to go in this big Foxconn factory in southern China with 400,000 people in one factory, and the change there is that where 2 years ago there'd be mainly women there, and 5 years ago it'd be mainly country people, you could tell by their weathered skin. Now it was mainly young urban men. You could tell by their fancy faux hawk hairdos and their shirts and everything. And that's just a sign of sort of that the 150-year saga of U.S. or European industrial development, from mill towns to big factories to service industries, is happening within about this 20-year period in China. So those are two. I may leave it at those two. I guess the other one would be wondering whether political change is going to mean anything. No.
China Airborne, you say that China is both a success and a failure. What is it succeeding at? What's it failing at?
So the meta point is, so how many people here have been to China? I think probably most of you. You know that one of the great things about China is that everything you say about it is true somewhere. And it's just so huge that it encompasses everything. So in saying that it's a success, I was partly making the point that it's a giant carnival that is changing every second. But success is, in the last 30 years, bringing hundreds of millions of people from the farm economy to the factory economy in a third the time that it happened any place else. And that is a huge, huge achievement. The failure is environmental, and it's political in various ways, and it's in foreign affairs. But the context I was arguing there is that while you look back on 30 years of success in farm to factory, it's by no means obvious that the next 30 years will be successful in low-wage factory to sort of high-end corporate professional world success. Things that made China successful so far are in some ways at odds with what they need to be successful and more successful in this next round.
So it's not inevitable that China will become the preeminent world power.
No, and I would argue unlikely that it will be. So I'll give you the very short pro-argument for China taking over the world, and then the somewhat the medium-length anti-argument. The pro-argument is scale. They have 4 times as many people as the U.S. does, so certainly their economy will become bigger. They only have to get 1/4 as rich as the United States to have a larger economy. They have a sense of national injustice over the last century in particular, and last 5 centuries of being sort of out of their place in the world. So you could imagine this and also combined with the United States not being able to address its problems. So if all those things happen, you can imagine China being more successful. I think, on the one hand, the U.S. is very different from previous failed imperial powers. That's Spain, Portugal, Holland, England. They were all little countries that were unnaturally extended. The United States is a big country. We now are, I think, the 3rd most populous country in the world. I mean, 3rd or 4th. It's China, India, and who else? U.S. So we have big territory, we have big resources, we have big people, we have a big economy, and I think we have assets no other nation matches in terms of absorbing the world's talent through immigration, which nobody else can really do, still having a very good university system, still having a culture of a combination of culture of resilience and innovation and the institutions that make that possible, from venture capital to copyright law and all the rest. China doesn't have these things. It has a big population, but can't have immigration. Its institutions of government and civil society are all under question. It is less liked by its neighbors the stronger it grows. And so I think it's better for the U.S. if China continues to prosper than if it doesn't. But I think the idea of a Chinese-dominated world is unlikely.
Is a war, a U.S.-China war of some sort, likely?
No, I don't. I mean, it's possible. I think we
showdown. Let's change
yes.
Showdown. Put
yes.
that in instead of war.
Yes. So the backstory here, in my view, is we usually talk about how bad governments in all different countries are and diplomats and screwing things up. I think it's actually quite impressive that for now 40 years, it was 40 years ago last month that Nixon first went to China, that in that time, both countries have managed surprisingly well, their leadership, a transition that could have been a real disaster. You know, of having a country grow as rapidly as China has, you can imagine that being way more disruptive to the reigning power of the United States than it has been. I think that's to America's credit in deciding that it's better for us if China grows than if it doesn't, and in China's credit in deciding it's better if they have sort of a cooperative relationship with the United States than if they don't, despite the many points of disagreement. Now, where could showdowns come? Over Taiwan, that's always possible. Mm-hmm. Day by day, things go fine among the PRC in Beijing, Taiwan in Taiwan, and the United States in Washington. But in theory, the countries can't get along, because in theory, China believes that Taiwan is just, part of it, and Taiwan doesn't feel that, and the U.S. is agnostic and doesn't want the Chinese to take it over militarily. So you can imagine that being pushed. The more likely one right now is not North Korea, but the Chinese-Japanese tensions over these islands, which is just insane. This is a purely sort of national prestige, national chest thumping as opposed to resources issue. But it's gotten sort of dangerous on both sides. It's bad for the U.S. because showdowns between China and Japan would be bad, number one. And number two, the U.S. is treaty bound to take Japan's side, which it would rather not do, too. I mean, we'd rather not get in the middle of this. So that you can imagine a showdown over that.
Does China have any practical influence over North Korea to keep them from going over the edge?
That's a really interesting and I think unknowable question, at least unknowable by me, or unknown by me. And I think that the line from people in U.S. diplomats is that China has more control over North Korea than other people do, but that's not very much. And they are often exasperated by the North Koreans, and they have a different set of interests from everybody else, because their interest in North Korea is that North Korea doesn't collapse, because they don't want a unified Korea, which would presumably be some kind of Western ally right there on their borders. Here's one side note worth mentioning. If you ever go to a Chinese military briefing, the map they show is really interesting, because it's China, and on every border, from their perspective, are U.S. troops. They're in South Korea, they're in Japan. They're down in Okinawa. They're making port calls in Vietnam and in Malaysia and in Singapore. They're in the stands. They're in Mongolia. So U.S. forces are all around China, and so they feel as if, don't give us that hard of a time with North Korea, sort of our only puppet ally there. So I think so they don't want it to collapse and have Korea be another bulwark of possible enemy states. An analogy that Chinese people make, and there's differences here, it's a careful analogy to use, is the U.S. with Israel. That the U.S. has more control over Israel than any other country does, and Israel is entirely different from North Korea. It's a modern democratic country as opposed to a backward nut state. But the United States has more control over Israel than anybody else does, but the United States has only some control over Israel. I think it's a similar situation.
Should we worry about Iran as we march around hot spots around the world?
Well, This is, if only you could consider sometime a career in broadcasting. So, yes, you're obviously extracting every important area of knowledge and news. Yes, we should worry about Iran, but number one, we have a country, North Korea, that actually has nuclear weapons and is promising to engulf the United States in, quote, a sea of fire. On the other hand, we have Iran, which may or may not have nuclear weapons at some point, and it's Iran that we're spending all of our time talking about blowing up, and not North Korea. I think that, I'll give you the backstory here. In 2004, The Atlantic had to plan a cover story for our December issue. What was interesting about our December 2004 issue is it would come out just after the 2004 election, but it would go to bed 2 weeks before the election. So we would have to produce this issue not knowing if Bush or Kerry was going to be the president, but it will come out after everybody in the reading it knew. So we thought, what would be an evergreen topic that would be true in either case? And so we did a war game article, which I wrote about. Let's see what it would mean to attack Iran preemptively. So we got all these generals and strategists and all that, and played out the war game. And the result was, if you thought the Iraq War was a bad idea, bombing Iran would be a way worse idea. Just apart from whether it's a good thing to do, it would be a stupid thing to do. And I think that has become only more true with the passage of time. So I think the difficult thing for the U.S. and also Israel is to be convincing enough in saying every option is on the table without actually believing that oneself. I think I have never met a military person from either the U.S. or Israel who has any enthusiasm at all for military action against Iran. So I think that their having a nuclear weapon would be destabilizing mainly and having more arms races in the Middle East and the region, but I think it's not worth bombing them.
The use of
for a peacenik sentiment here.
use of drones in targeted assassinations. Is that moral?
Is it moral?
Yeah.
We have a compared with what question. Everybody here, I assume, saw the movie Lincoln, where for a moral cause, Lincoln presided over great hideousness, as did FDR, as did George Washington, as did everybody else. So it becomes a case of comparative morality and legal checks and balances. I think it is, the morality of it worries me less than the strategic and Republican, small r Republican issues for the United States. The strategic issues are, over time, this really builds resentment and hatred. The idea you're just attacking people from 3,000, 10,000 miles away. And it's not going to be forever that we're the only ones with this technology. And so I think that is the strategic issue. The constitutional issue is that for now 50 years, it's become harder and harder for presidents to do things domestically, and therefore they're all the more drawn to the sort of executive order world of doing things in secret. I think it's bad we don't have declarations of war anymore. I think it's bad that we don't have any more than 1% of the population exposed to war in any way. So this is an extension of that. Its morality is a close call with any other act of war, in my mind. But as a something for our nation to be doing, I think it's bad for us to be doing this. What do you think?
I just asked the question. I have one more, by the way, and then I want to get to audience questions. Rachel, where are you? Rachel and Nick. So they have microphones. If you've got a question, wave your hand and they'll get over to you. But while they're getting set up, one more for you, Jim. Along the lines of executive authority and the rest, Barack Obama, strengths and weaknesses as president.
That's an interesting question. So I did an article about a year and a half ago, which was meant directly to address this issue. And the premise for the article was it's important to do something before a re-election, not because you want to influence the re-election, but because after a re-election run, you simply can never again judge objectively what a president does in his first term. If he's reelected, then everything looks in retrospect like part of a grand plan. You know, that Bill Clinton lost the midterms of '94, but it was part of a repositioning, or Ronald Reagan had terrible midterm losses also, but it was part of this long strategy. Whereas if he loses, like Jimmy Carter, my former employer, then everything he did was part of his bumbling narrative, even the Camp David peace accords, energy bill, and all the rest. So I wanted to say, before we know how this turns out, let's see what we can make sense of. And also, re-election matters because, especially for Obama, a second term would mean he could make the health care law go into effect rather than have it be overturned. He presumably, if he ever gets around to it, could appoint more judges who agree with him, and that would have some effect on the judiciary, et cetera. So what I tried to compare was the narrative of Obama as a chess master with a narrative of Obama as a pawn. That is, if he seemed for the first year or two to be too compliant with the Republicans, saying, oh yes, let's see if we can agree, while they were saying, we just want to beat you. Did that mean the long game, or did it mean naivete? And since he won re-election, and since the Republicans are demographically becoming isolated, you can say he had a long game view. I think in some ways he was being too compliant. But I think that the main thing about his strengths and weaknesses is I think he's getting better at the job. And here's what I mean by that. What has really impressed me, both when I worked with Carter and I've seen other presidents, is the job requires so many skills that nobody is good at the job. You have to be a good public speaker, a good private negotiator. You have to have a deliberative temperament. You have to have quick processing of information. You have to have emotional IQ. You have to have good health. You have to have all these things. Nobody has them all. And so what we learned in the first term is what ones you don't have. And I think what we learned for Obama is what he didn't have of various kinds of EQ, sort of emotional quotient, which is that he seemed to be poor at reading legislators, being able to deal with them. He was relatively good at speaking to over TV or whatever, but there's almost nobody in the Democratic Party who felt some kind of personal bond or loyalty to him, because here's an important temperamental point. So Bill Clinton I happen to have known for a long time, and he's a real secretariat-style sort of sport of nature in terms of his abilities. But one of the things that's most unusual about him is most people, if you make them perform or be in big crowds or whatever, they get tired. He gets stronger. He's tired when he walks into a crowd, and he feels great when he walks out, and he stays up all night, and things go wrong. Whereas, whereas Obama, like most normal people, he works a crowd and he wants to get away. He wants to go read a book. He wants to go check out the internet, have a smoke, whatever. And so, because of that, he didn't do the thing he didn't do was all these sort of extroverted type things you do in dealing with legislators, dealing with regulators, dealing with foreign representatives. Nobody in the sort of governmental structure felt as if they knew him. So I think his corresponding strengths of intelligence and judgment, in my view, and a sense of, in most issues, rectitude and ability, quite a very effective writer, to my mind, those are clearly outweigh the emotional limits. But I think he has become somewhat better at finding ways to at least feign feign sincerity and feign enthusiasm and wanting to meet with people. So I think he's getting better at the job, and I think it's also, I predict this, mark this down. So during the 2012 campaign of Romney against Obama, a lot of Republican commentators would say, oh, that Bill Clinton, we loved him. He really had an idea of how to sort of bring the nation together. This was the same guy they were trying to impeach, back when he was president. It's going to happen with Obama, too. The same guy who is now a socialist and a Muslim, 10 years from now, they say, oh, that Obama was great, but this Andrew Cuomo, whoever, he's terrible. So I think that Obama has he's made his opponents recognize his inevitability. And so I think, like Clinton, and Democrats have done this to a degree with Reagan, too. They sort of are now willing to accept Reagan's bigness in the job.
Are they going to do that with George W. Bush over time?
I do not think so. I think he probably, if any of us knew him as a person, I bet we might like the version of George W. Bush we'd see now. I think the George W. Bush who came to the presidency had what I would think of as sort of a preppy wise guy tone to him. Bush is a couple of years older than I am, but here is the particular cross to bear that George W. Bush has caused for me, apart from anything involving politics. It's a well-known fact of anthropology that across racial groups you don't make really precise distinctions about how somebody looks. So if there were a 7-foot Chinese person in the room right now, you might think he was Yao Ming, even though a Chinese person would say, "What do you mean? He doesn't look anything like Yao Ming." So every single person in China was sure that I was George W. Bush. And I could have a lot of fun with that with the taxi drivers. Yeah, I'm leaving Cheney in charge. It was so that is the way I've had to imagine what it'd be like to be George W. Bush. He seems to me a somewhat humbled man now. Cheney is relentlessly sniping at Obama. Bush is not. Bush, I think, is being a very dignified ex-president, getting out of the way. So I think that he, as a person, will probably be somewhat rehabilitated. I argue that he is in a contest with James Buchanan for the worst president in U.S. history, and I think he wins in terms of the destruction done to America's economy, international position, and all the rest during his time for needless reasons. I don't think he's a bad person, but I think it was hideously mistaken decisions, especially in his first term.
Let's have some audience questions for James Fallows. Nick, go ahead, please.
The Chinese have a rapidly growing aging population, much more so than we baby boomers in the United States. How are they going to deal with that problem and that issue? It seems to me that could be enormous.
Yes. And so, as you all know, China has had for 30-plus years a very draconian one-child policy, which is becoming less draconian because it's had its effect. The population curve has now changed, and I believe China has just now gotten to a higher median age than the U.S. has, which is making them the first country ever to become old while still being poor. And so the downsides of the skewed population distortion in China, apart from the brutality in a number of families of the enforced abortions, which are not supposed to happen anymore and are mainly local abuses when they do, it means there's a huge gender imbalance. There's probably like 125 men per 100 women in the affected groups, which has consequences. It has this demographic effect you're mentioning. It has personality effects, a nation of only children. It has all kinds of effects. Most people, in my view, argue that the effects of not dealing with the population would have been even worse than these effects. So that's an argument that will go on. And I think there's a book coming out by some American journalist soon arguing the reverse, that this was a huge, huge mistake for China. I don't know. But I think on the particular thing of the actuarial effects, one reason why China's national savings rate, which is above 50%, by far the highest ever in economic history anywhere, is partly for this reason. There's no real public medical care program. Medical care is cash up front, so people have to save for that. There's a sort of odd mortgage program, so people have to save for their houses. Retirement is all, again, your own cash. In most big enterprises, there is a mandatory retirement age of 50 for women and 55 for men. So there's a very long sort of self-financed retirement time. So it's because people have seen this coming for a long time. That's one more reason for the skew towards savings, because they know there's a reason to have these savings. So it has lots of distorting effects. On the other hand, stabilizing China's population has had some benefits. Here is an image to keep in mind. I mentioned this in the first chapter of my book, but in case anyone has not read my recent book, my latest book, I will give it to you. So China's arable land is almost the same as the U.S. east of the Mississippi. And the rest is desert and mountain and everything. In that land, east of the Mississippi, you have population of the U.S. plus Canada, plus Mexico, plus Brazil, plus Haiti, plus everything in the Western Hemisphere, plus Nigeria, plus Japan. That's all Mississippi eastward. And so you can see why they think the weight of people is a factor.
By the way, it's a good book, China Airborne.
Well,
actually,
thank you.
It really is. Rachel.
Hi, my name is Jacob Stock. I'm a senior at the St. John's Preparatory School up the hill. And I just wanted to personally thank you so much for being here. As an aspiring journalist myself, it just means a lot. And to have Mr. Gary Eichten here, it's just an honor. I was reading the New York Times today in the library, and there was an article about immigration and the new bipartisan plan. And you touched on immigration as being one of the big advantages we have over China. And I believe it's 10 years and $2,000 just to get a green card. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know your thoughts about this.
So first, I'll do it. First history, then politics, and then policy. The history is the United States has, of course, had wave after wave after wave of immigration, and every single one has been disruptive when it occurred. Whether it was Germans in the mid-19th century or Irish after that. The late 19th century, it was tremendously disruptive with Eastern Europeans and Slavs and all the rest. This actually occasioned the most draconian crackdown on immigration in the early 20th century. The Vietnamese and others. So at 1964, it's now been almost 50 years of a radical change in immigration under Lyndon Johnson of basically not having it be white Europeans anymore, but opening it to the world, which I think is good. And it's been disruptive every single time. There's always been the argument that, yeah, these previous ones are okay, but these new people, these new people are ones we can't really absorb. So it's not surprising that this is a source of friction because it always has been. And what's been distinctive for the U.S. is that still on balance we've absorbed it and it's been just unambiguously a benefit to the U.S. I think that it's, if you look at all the Nobel Prize winners who were born someplace else, you could say, oh, that shows the Americans are falling down, they can't produce this talent. No, it means these people have to come here, to realize their ambitions and dreams. Same with the formation of new companies, et cetera. So historically, this has been always difficult, but in my view, always beneficial. And so that's point one. On politics, again, I was saying I've been in California for the last while. California just this year went from having the largest group. It's been majority-minority for quite a while. But just this year it became majority Hispanic, or not majority Hispanic, where the largest group became Hispanic. It's now about 40% Hispanic, 39% other white, and then black and Asian after that. And one of the effects of this is over the last 20 years, the Republicans, when they were doing the Electoral College, they'd always start with California as their base. In the days of Reagan and even the first George Bush. Now they start with California as the 55 votes they have no hope of claiming. And there's no statewide Republican official in California. They have essentially, I think of them as the little arms on T-Rex in their role in California. They're there, but they don't really do much. And that is the, and that is the path. I think the national Republicans know that's the path they're on unless they can do something. It wouldn't ever be the same nationally because nationwide, the Hispanic population is in the mid-teens someplace. It's never going to be 40% as it is in California. But if you have Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona becoming Democratic rather than Republican, and Texas, if Texas ever made that change, there would never be a Republican president again until something else happened. So I think the Republicans recognize, to their credit, that this is an area where it's a subject where they need to broaden the tent and make themselves appealing to Latinos for whom they think they have some cultural affinity. So I think that's why an agreement may be possible here as it is impossible on most of the things. On the policy of it, I think that if you accept, on the one hand, that immigration is disruptive and can have some displacing effect on people, so you have to sort of meter the rate at which people come in. Number two, that the most destructive part of immigration is having a large illegal pool, because they can be oppressed and they can be, they drive down wage rates for other people. And number three, you want to find ways to bring in people at the high end too. Some path that would have the, some solution that would have the path to citizenship, that is making currently illegal people find some way to regularize themselves and bring in more people for occupational specialties. I think that's something that will actually happen this year, which will be a good thing. Rick?
As a journalist, you're called on to make predictions from time to time. I've seen some of your predictions. Are you ever surprised by predictions that you make and they actually come true? And which ones?
One of my themes is that journalists should spend less time on predictions and more time on trying to understand what's happened. And so it's really interesting. Before every election, there'll be 90% of the activity will be, well, which state is going to go which way, and it's usually wrong, and that never matters. Now, it may be the emergence of big data techniques and Nate Silver and all the rest that may change it, and it'll be actually fact-based as opposed to just, well, my gut tells me that Romney's on a roll. So I think there is too much of a bias to predictions because it's like sports. 5 minutes after a game ends, you don't care about the specific score, but the previous 2 weeks, you're saying, well, I think that the Patriots are going to do well here. So the predictions I have tried to make in the Atlantic are things where you can say, if you look at all the fundamentals, things are trending in a certain direction. That was the argument when 10 years ago I was here talking about Iraq, saying that if you simply talk with everybody who's been involved in this kind of situation before, they can tell you, boy, the first thing you have to worry about is looting. And if you're not concerned about that, you're going to never recover. And the next thing you have to do is not disband the army. If you do that, you're going to be in bad shape. So that is one kind of prediction. So the predictions are saying, let's look at a corpus of available knowledge and see what light that sheds. One of the rare actual predictions I tried to do was in 2005. This was just before I moved to China. We were trying to find some way to talk about the financial bubble and the housing bubble in a less boring way than normal. So I wrote a story. I wrote the imagined history of the 2016 presidential election. And this was when both Republicans and Democrats, their parties had collapsed because of everything that was going wrong with the economy, and an independent party was being formed. We had our first black president. I called that wrong. I thought he was going to be a Republican former general, not Powell, but somebody else like that. But I was essentially arguing, if you look at all the things that are happening in the financial and housing sector, something is going to blow up here. And so this was a memo from the Karl Rove of 2016, looking back on the history of the previous 10 years and how it led the way to the collapse of both parties. So I talked about how there was bound to be a financial crash in the late 2000s because it just couldn't happen otherwise, and the parties were going to not be able to do anything about it, et cetera. So that was something where I would have been both that and Iraq. I was trying to have a cautionary example so these things wouldn't happen. In fact, both of those things exactly happened. But I think I'll maybe retire from the prediction business with those two.
I think you said, Jim, at one point that Iraq was the biggest strategic mistake in U.S. history, something close to that. Have we learned whatever lessons there were to learn from that mistake?
First, a brief defense of that argument. One is, maybe I'll confine it to post-World War II or post the last century or so. The reason I think it was such a mistake is it was entirely an unforced error. Vietnam was a series of day-by-day decisions that at the moment you could understand. And there's after you've done 1,000 of those decisions, you were in a bad position. Iraq was an out of the blue, let's invade this country choice, that didn't have to happen. That's why I thought it was so destructive. On learning the lessons, I submit to you that every single person who is now saying there's an imminent threat of WMD from Iran and that military action is what has to happen and it will work out fine, these people all said exactly the same thing about Iraq, these same exact people. So the fact they are being given a hearing again suggests some limit in lessons learned.
Rachel.
Hi, my name is Li Chuan Liang, 100% made in China and manufactured in the U.S. And my question would be, probably we all believe young people would be the future of a country. And my question is, like, when you were in China, have you ever been in touch with any Chinese young people? And what's
Yes.
the difference that you think the Chinese young people are from the U.S.
Yes. Now, that's an excellent question. And I should say, as I've said in other places, and sorry, did I interrupt you?
Yeah. Well, I have one more question.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
For the U.S. people. Is like as we know, like more than 10 years ago, when the after the 9/11, and the U.S. economy has been affected, and correspondingly, the world economy also has been affected. So for this time, the bombing in Boston, do you think it will have the same effect to the economy,
So
for the US?
those are good questions. To answer the second one first,
Okay, thank you.
I thank you very much. I think that this will be, first, it's entirely different as an incident. 3 people have now died, including one tragically, a Chinese student, which is, a child, a mother, American child, American mother, and a Chinese student. All of those are horrible in their own ways. On the other hand, it was 3,000 people who were killed in 9/11. And I was reading someplace this afternoon that just in that the Boston bombing, horrible as it was only the 4th most deadly terrorist explosion of the past week, if you're counting ones in Mogadishu and a couple in Iraq, et cetera. So in the United States, it was terrible. But I think there is some resolve in the United States not to distort ourselves in the same way as was the case after 9/11. So I think it was a horrible episode, but I think it won't have the same ripple effect. On the young people, I explained in my book, and I was saying to some of the classes today, most Americans who are in China, including me, really like Chinese people and like Chinese young people. There's a kind of life and vitality and sense of humor that I think many Americans find easy to connect with. I went to a lot of universities in China. I gave lots of talks, met lots of people. And I think it is really great that so many people like you are seeing the world. If you stay in the United States, that'll be great. If you go back to China, it will be great, just because you understand something about how the rest of the world works, what's good about America, what's bad about America, what's good and bad about China, and most of all, you will know as people, all the people in this room, your friends from St. John's, St. Ben, and the people you've met. Same too for Americans who are in China. They will know lots of Chinese people as people. And I think that the more of this interaction that occurs between young people, the more they see the world. I think so I have good hopes for young Chinese people and young American people too. Thank you.
Back in the room.
Yeah.
As Gary was taking you on your tour of hotspots of the world, he missed one, and that's Syria. I wonder if you could say something about what you see happening there and in the larger context of the Arab Spring, where that's coming from and where that's going.
This is an important question on an area where I don't really know enough to say things with much confidence or much authority. And so I've never been to Syria, and I don't really know the dynamics there well enough to know how to judge the difference between where the U.S., there are these situations where the rest of the world needs to step in, and there are situations where the rest of the world makes things only worse by stepping in. I don't know myself how to judge this. It's a horrible situation. I assume that, I think I trust Obama's caution in these things. I thought his caution about Libya was correct, that it was being involved but not right there in the front, et cetera. So I'll say with respect, I just don't know enough to say. I think the Arab Spring more generally, I know a little bit more about, and I think this is a predictable, messy and unpleasant stage that is better than the continuation of the status quo ante. That if you had simple autocracies going on for a long time, the change would be worse when it happened. So this is difficult, but it's better than the other path. And that's about as much as I know, I'm sorry to say.
Over here, Rachel.
Jim, let me try to pin you down in an area where you are an expert. I was driving here tonight, listening to the president, more angry than I've ever heard any president about the gun registration bill going down. And he talked about 90% of the Democrats voting for it, 90% of the Republicans voting against it. Typical gridlock. Do you think the media, the MSNBCs, the Foxes, the Rush Limbaughs, are driving the dysfunction in Congress, or are they feeding off of it? And how do we stop it?
That's a very interesting question, and I think The short answer would be, I think the media are more reflecting and symptoms of this divide than they are causing it, although they may intensify it, but I don't think they're the prime movers here. I think there are some more fundamental things. Again, it's worth noting that it's not even that the bill went down, it's that it wasn't allowed to come to a vote. And remember the lines that President Obama used in the State of the Union speech. It's interesting that his speeches are generally seen as eloquent, but you can hardly ever remember any lines from them, because it's sort of paragraph-level eloquence as opposed to line-level eloquence. But one thing he did say in the State of the Union speech was, Gabby Giffords deserves a vote. The people of Newtown deserve a vote. These people deserve a vote. And what he meant was having the bill come up for a vote on the merits, and that's what went down, that 54 of the senators, representing about 64% of the U.S. population, voted for this to come up to a vote, and it would have passed. But the minority said, no, it can't come up to a vote. So I think that is a change in sort of the norms of politics. Here is something else. So I think there is blame all around, but there are times in history where one party or the other is sort of more out of step. The Democrats in the sort of 72 era, the McGovern era, they were more out of step. The Republicans in 1964 with Goldwater. To me, it is simply true that the Republicans are driving the polarization now. If you think of the presidential candidates they were considering in this last race, if you think that people like Lindsey Graham is now terrified of being primaried, from that's why he was taking the line he was against Chuck Hagel. I think this is a moment like the 1964 period where part of the Republican Party thinks they survive by becoming more pure, and parts think they have to broaden themselves out and move back towards the middle. So I think you have some of that tendency among the Democrats, and there is polarization, but I think it is being driven by this cycle of the Republican Party, which George W. Bush didn't believe in. He believed in compassionate conservative, appeal to Latinos. He got, as governor of Texas, he got a large share of the Latino vote. I think he won the Latino vote as governor of Texas. So I think it is polarization that partly is driven by a party that has to find its way. And I think we all need to find ways to sort of heal it. But if somebody's going to primary Lindsey Graham, what can you do about that?
Okay, two more questions, one here, one there.
And I'll be tertiary, sorry.
Over here.
Thank you for coming to campus. Several times during your talk tonight, Jim, you mentioned that you've been in class all day, so you've been behind on news. And so just kind of tell us about what it's like, demanding lifestyle, having to be constantly up to date on news, and then also if both of you could talk about being members of the media, where do you get your information?
In my case, I find a sort of divided path in life. So ever since I got out of graduate school 40 years ago, I've lived half the time in D.C. and half other places, usually in sort of 2 and 3 year episodes. And that sort of reflects the way there are times when I'm immersed in D.C. politics and following everything and weighing in and going on the radio. There are times when I go to Malaysia for a year or two or go to wherever. And I think I just like having the different chapters. When I'm in D.C., I'm sort of in the fray. But for the Atlantic, for our long articles, you have to spend a lot of time reporting them and writing them. So there are times when I just try to wall it off. Otherwise, I listen to probably all the same sources of info as you do, to NPR, to stuff on the various online feeds. And I don't necessarily like being in the media. I love being a writer for this magazine because it's the way I've been able to go around the world for a long time and learn about different things.
Do you enjoy, you write a blog and of course the magazine articles, which is more fun for you?
It's a night and day difference because I only do things on our website if they're easy to do, if I can sit there and do it in 5 minutes. I find that magazine and book writing is always hard because there are formal constraints and there's a certain different density to it. For a blog article, you can say, okay, here's the point. And you can just make the point and you're done. And you can't start an article saying, okay, here's the point. So that's to me, there's a very clear division between the two. How about for you?
I get my news from public radio, surprise, surprise, newspapers, and ESPN. Last question over here.
Yeah.
what do you think of China's new leadership? Do you think these 7 top leaders will do a better job in terms of maintaining the balance between economic development and political liberalization? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. The short answer is, I hope so. And I think everybody in China hopes so too. I don't think anybody in China knows. And certainly I don't know either. I've talked with people who say, yes, yes, yes. Xi Jinping knows his historical duty is to reform all the things that need to be reformed. The pollution and the inequalities and the corruption and all these other things, he knows that that's his duty. And otherwise the system will be in crisis if he can't do those things. There are other people who say, he may have big ideas, but the system is bigger than any person. And it's just, the interests are so strong, the military and the people and the state-owned enterprises, that he can have all the big ideas in the world and no one will know. I started asking people in China, what will be the test? How will you know one way or the other? And what somebody said is, if within the next 6 or 7 months, some official is arrested and put in jail who is one of his friends, not just some enemy faction, but somebody who's sort of within his team who is arrested and put in jail for corruption or something. So I don't know. I hope that he is able to have a reformer vision. I want to believe the people who tell me that, and some of them are very convinced, and we'll all be watching. What do you think? Are you hopeful or pessimistic? Good. Well, I think that is a right note to end on. We should all be hopeful.
James Fallows.